Danger Along the Ohio, Chapter 13. Rumbling voices woke Amos and scared him, too, when he remembered what had happened. He sat up and looked around. The fire had been rekindled, and the men were squatting around it, talking as they held chunks of venison over the flames. Amos stood up, and a passing Indian nodded to him, a greeting that seemed to say he was one of them now. Could he ever be Shawnee? Then, as he glanced down at Clara, Amos's breath caught in his throat. Clara's eyes were wide open. They warmed with a weak smile. "What's happening, Amos? Where did they—" Amos dismissed the Indian's presence with a wave of his hand. What mattered most was that Clara had beaten the fever. He grinned at her. "You've been out of your head for 2 days," he said, reaching over to feel her forehead. "The fever's gone. The willow tea must have done it." "Are they the ones we've been running from?" she asked, pointing to the men around the fire. She noticed the cow for the first time, and Jonathan sleeping beside her. "Thank goodness they're all right. Those savages better not do anything to them, or—" She left her threat unspoken. Amos felt a surge of relief. Clara's body might be weak, but her peppery spirit was still intact and rising. "We'll be all right if we do what they say. They plan to take us to their village. The old man in red moccasin—" "I knew we couldn't trust that Indian," Clara said, her eyes flashing in red moccasin's direction. "The old man speaks some English," Amos said. "I talked to him last night." As he glanced at the Indians, he remembered the chunk of meat he had saved. Removing the leaf wrapping, he saw it had turned a gray, unappetizing color. Clara needed something better. "I'm going to go get you some food," he said. "Be careful, Amos, you can't—" Clara's voice faded away behind him as he approached Red Moccasin and his grandfather at the campfire. Amos stood before them, his gaze shifting from one to the other. "My sister needs something to eat. Could I have a piece of meat for her?" The other Indians by the fire ceased their activity, their eyes watchful but curious. One man pointed toward Clara, prompting the others to look. Glancing back at his sister, Amos could see that she returned their stares with bold defiance. The look on her face gave Amos courage, and he turned back to demand the food. But Red Moccasin was already there, handing him a stick of cooked venison. Nodding his thanks, Amos carried it back to Clara, grinning. "You scared them into giving it to me," he said. "Oh, sassafras," was Clara's only comment before biting into the meat. When Jonathan woke, they shared the meat and some of Queen Anne's milk, each swallow seeming to increase their strength and lift their spirits. But they were reminded of their predicament when the Indians began to gather up their few belongings. One man kicked the fire apart, sending white ashes billowing into the air. "What are they doing?" Jonathan asked in a quivering voice. "It looks like as if they're getting ready to travel," Amos said. He glanced down at Clara. Even if she could walk, she wouldn't be able to walk very far. When she gave out, he would carry her, Amos resolved, because he was afraid of what the Indians might do if she couldn't keep up. Just then, Amos saw Red Moccasin come toward him, speaking Shawnee words that sounded like a command. The boy must have been sent to get them moving, but Amos wasn't ready to go yet. He had to try once more to strike a bargain with the Shawnee. "Just a minute," he said in a loud voice, catching everyone's attention, but fastening his eyes on the old man. "I ask you again to free my sister and brother. I'll go with you. Just leave them here." He waited, holding his breath. "No!" Clara's single scorching word spun Amos around. She was leaning against a tree trunk, her eyes blazing. "We all go free, or we all go with them." For a brief moment, Amos wondered how she had found the strength to stand, let alone fight. "Stay out of this, Clara. I think we can get them to—" "They can't separate us. I won't let them." "Clara, be still. Maybe they'll let you and Jonathan go on to Marietta. Besides, I can learn their ways. I can be Shawnee." He bit his bottom lip. "Maybe living with them I can forget about Simon." His last words were barely audible. There was a breathless silence as Amos and Clara faced each other, everyone else there forgotten. Then Clara sagged against the tree, hugging her arms around her chest, her eyes smoldering. "Oh, Amos, there's no way to run from what you did. You'll carry it with you wherever you go." Amos frowned, trying to recall what the old man had told him in last night's darkness. He hadn't said anything about running away from the blame. He had talked about walking away. Amos wanted to try to reason out the man's words, but there wasn't time right now. He had to convince the old man to leave Clara and Jonathan behind, despite Clara's objections. Ignoring her pleading eyes, he faced the Indian leader. I pulled Red Moccasin out of the river. You owe me something in return. Please, just let them go. It seemed to Amos that Red Moccasin recognized the name they had given him, because he stepped forward to stand beside the old man. He might be able to persuade his grandfather to let them go, but would he? When Amos looked into the old man's flinty, unyielding eyes, he knew there would be no help from anyone. I'll go live with Shawnee. Hearing the finality in their leader's voice, some of the men picked up their weapons and packs and went striding off through the trees. The Indian leader and Red Moccasin started after them. No, they stay here and I go with you, Amos called out, desperate to stop them and make them listen, but it was no use. They walked on as if he had never spoken. Amos turned back to Clara. The old man might change his mind, he said. Clara's eyes looked unusually large in her gaunt face. No, he won't, she said, but at least we'll be together. An Indian motioned them on. Amos let Clara lean on him while Jonathan fell in behind them, leading Queen Anne. They had barely started when an odd sound from Jonathan made Amos turn around. One of the Indians had taken Queen Anne's lead rope and was untying it from the cow's neck. What are you doing? Amos's voice was loud enough to stop everyone in sight. Ignoring Amos, the Indian worked the rope into a coil and slipped it over his shoulder. What are you doing? Amos repeated even louder. The Indian leader appeared at Amos's side. Leave cow, he said in a matter-of-fact voice. What? Came Amos's shout, followed by an anguished cry from Clara. She ran and flung herself on Queen Anne, her arms clasping the heavy, long neck. The cow, displaying her usual patience with humans, began to chew her cud. This animal is the only thing we have left. Amos's voice rose in protest. We brought her all the way from Pennsylvania. If you think The hard expression on the old man's face made Amos pause. Realizing he was in no position to threaten anyone, his next words came out soft and pleading. She can't get by on her own. She has to be milked every day and watered. Amos remembered hearing stories of families fleeing from hostile Indians, having to leave everything behind. When they returned to their homesteads, sometimes they would find their animals unharmed. Amos's father had explained why. The Indians were accustomed to a diet of wild game and had no use for the white man's livestock, for milk or for meat. Amos looked around at the waiting Shawnee. Most of them were burdened with heavy packs of deer meat. They seemed eager to be on their way, and he knew they would have no patience with a plodding cow. We go. Cow stay. The old man turned to resume his place in line, but Clara's sudden explosion stopped him. I'm not going without her, she screamed. I won't leave her. I won't. Amos took a step toward Clara, his breath tight in his chest. He wasn't sure what she might do, and he couldn't let her put them all in jeopardy. If their captors were determined to leave Queen Anne, neither he nor Clara could stop them. Amos, tell him I won't leave her. Again, Amos faced the Indian leader. She raised the cow from a calf. The animal's more than just a... The man wasn't listening. Instead, he turned to the man with the rope and gave a curt order. Without a moment's hesitation, the Indian stepped forward, laid the muzzle of his gun against Queen Anne's head. For several seconds, Clara was too stunned to move. Then she screeched and lunged for the Indian's weapon. At the last moment, Amos grabbed her and dragged her away. As she slumped to the ground, he whirled toward the old man, hands outstretched, his voice hoarse. Tell him not to shoot. Don't hurt her. We'll leave her. Just don't. Suddenly, Red Moccasin appeared beside his grandfather and began speaking to him in a low, urgent tone. The old man listened to him, asked a question in return, then nodded at the boy's response. Amos held his breath, wondering whether the boy was interceding for them or urging his grandfather to kill the cow. For a moment, the old man studied Amos. Then, with a quick gesture to the man holding the gun, he turned and walked away. Amos swallowed hard as he watched the Indian slowly lower the gun. He thought his legs were going to collapse under him. He clamped his jaws together and forced himself to stand erect. In that brief moment when his gaze met Red Moccasins, Amos knew the boy had saved Queen Anne's life. Amos reached down and pulled Clara to her feet. They'd have to leave the cow, but at least she'd be alive. Come on, we've got to go on now without her. There's nothing else we can do. Tears streamed down Clara's face. Oh, Amos, how can we? What'll happen to her? I've always taken care of her. Amos urged her ahead. Here, put your arm around my waist and hang on to me. She tried to stop and turn back, but he wouldn't let her. He felt her feet dragging as if she could barely lift them off the ground. It's no use, you can't do anything, he said. The old man won't change his mind. The Indians strung out through the trees, with Amos, Clara, and Jonathan in the middle of the line. One Indian trod close behind them, at times almost bumping against Amos and Clara. Amos looked over his shoulder once and saw Queen Anne trailing at a great distance. He hoped they would soon lose her, or she would give up following them. If she continued after them, the old man might still order her shot. They straggled up a steep hill, and at the top, Clara pulled away from Amos to gaze back through the woods. Queen Anne was still visible among the trees, but she had stopped to nibble at a low-hanging branch. Amos let out a silent breath of relief. She would never catch up now. Clara stood beside him, her hands clasped under her chin, her thin shoulders shaking. Near starved and weak from the fever, Amos knew she had little strength left. The loss of Queen Anne might be more than she could endure. She's all alone, Clara said between ragged breaths. She's never been alone her whole life. She won't know. Come on, Clara. There's no use looking anymore. Amos pulled her away, waving Jonathan ahead of him. Maybe someone will find her. It was a feeble hope, he knew. There were thousands of miles of empty wilderness and a lot more preying animals than people. Clara seemed to walk in a daze, bumping into fallen logs and tripping over roots. Her glittering eyes made Amos fear that the fever had returned. No one uttered a word, not even the Indians, as the silent procession covered mile after mile, angling toward the sinking sun. The Ohio River lay far behind them now. Afternoon had wore away to dusk by the time they stopped for the night, beside a weedy stream. Soon, after a fire was built, the pungent aroma of roasting venison scented the woods. The Indians didn't need to worry about smoke, Amos mused, because this was their country. He eyed Clara as she stretched out on her stomach, her face hidden in her arms. She wasn't concerned about the Indians, he knew, or what lay ahead for the three of them. She was thinking of Queen Anne. Moving closer to the fire, Amos stared with longing at the cooking meat. He and Clara and Jonathan needed nourishment. If the men didn't give him some of the meat soon, he would just take it. His fear of them was fading. After all, it wasn't likely they would harm a person they intended to adopt. As if they had read his thoughts, one of the men brought Amos a generous chunk of raw meat and indicated he should cook his own. That suited Amos. He'd make sure it was cooked just right. After they had eaten their fill, Amos wrapped the leftover meat in green leaves and placed it in Clara's knapsack. The three of them lay down to rest. They had chosen a low place between two trees not far from the fire. Though Amos couldn't see anyone outside the camp circle, he was sure someone had been assigned to guard them. "What'll happen when we get to their village?" Jonathan asked. "There's no need to worry," Amos murmured. "They're going to adopt us." "Adopt us?" Jonathan exclaimed. "I don't want to be an Indian. I want to live with Papa." "We don't have a say in the matter," Amos said. "Besides, we don't even know if—" He stopped himself. Jonathan might as well go on believing their father was alive. He could be, for all they knew. "I wonder how Queen Anne is," Clara said. "She must be awful lonesome." She just might find her way to Marietta," Amos said, hoping to cheer her up. But the thought depressed him. If the cow did wander into Marietta and their father was there, Don't think about that, Amos scolded himself. Think about surviving. The venison had strengthened him so that he felt almost like his old self again. Clara seemed to be improving too. A good night's rest would prepare them for tomorrow's travel. He hoped Clara could sleep. Amos opened his eyes, wondering what had wakened him. The fire had gone out, and it was so dark he couldn't see anything. He knew Clara and Jonathan were there beside him, though, because he could hear their breathing. Just then, somewhere off to his right, he heard a twig snap, then another. He held his breath and listened. Something was moving out there. He leaned over to Clara and laid a hand over her mouth. She jumped at his touch, but then lay still as he whispered in her ear, "I think there's somebody coming. Listen." Motionless, breathing stopped. They waited. There was a stealthy sound as if a branch had been brushed aside, then swung back into place. It could be the Indian guard on his night vigil, Amos thought, but he had a strange feeling of something closing in on them. He squeezed Clara's shoulder. "Wake Jonathan, but don't let him make any noise." Moments later, a light appeared, and then another on the opposite side of camp. Suddenly, there were lights all around them, flaming branches flying through the air and falling amid the sleeping Indians. The confused men awoke to the raining fire. They jumped to their feet, yelling and casting off fiery blankets. Gunshots cracked in the distance. Amos, Clara, and Jonathan flattened themselves on the ground as the sounds of the fighting roared over the camp like a thunderstorm.